So we're joined today by three speakers from industry that helps us to pull this guide together. Alex Taylor, a senior technical specialist at the NHBC. Graham Gribben, Group Technical Director from Crest Nicholson, and Peter Clennell, a Group Technical Services and Innovations Manager from Persimmon Homes. Welcome to all of you today, and thank you for joining us. Gavin Thorne, the Group Head of Infrastructure and Utilities from Barratt Developments, is unfortunately not able to join us today, having broken his arm in two places in a cycling accident at the weekend. We wish him a speedy recovery. I'd also like to acknowledge others who've supported and fed into the guide, including Andy Mullins from Hill Group, and also the publishing team from Studio Partington and Libertat, as well as other contributors and supporters from the Office of Zero Emission Vehicles, from Department of Levelling Up, Homes and Communities, also others, the Joint Authorities Group, Point and GTC. Various conversations have really helped us to arrive at where we are. A couple of months ago, we were able to launch our Part S Where to Start guide, and you'll find this on our website if you go to the guidance section, and indeed the Part S section has a digital version of this guide, and you can download the PDF if you prefer to print it and view it that way. Also, it's worth pointing out that the government has introduced or published their own FAQs on Part S, which sits on the .gov website, and that's signposted also from our website to help you find that. So these two really useful pieces of guidance have come along together to help us understand Part S at a time when I think many sites are just arriving perhaps towards the requirement of having to put Part S into practice, even though it's been just over a year now since the regulation was introduced. So I'm going to speak to you initially just about the workflow for developers that we've put into the guide and introduce that for you. I'll bring members of the panel in to talk about specific issues, and then we'd like to hit some of the questions that have been asked and others that you may like to ask today in a discussion session at the end. So if at the bottom of your screens you can find the Q&A button, that's the place to ask all your questions. Please feel free to put them into that box as we move forward, and we'll address them as we can and in the discussion. Thank you. Okay, so Part S, what is it? Well, in principle, there's a requirement for every new dwelling to have an EV charge point. And additionally, for buildings that have many car parking spaces, more than 10, there's a requirement to provide future connection locations. And this is because it's much more cost effective to do that at the start of a development than trying to retrofit these things after the event. And it's really a chicken and egg thing. In order to encourage the uptake of electric vehicles, we need to make sure that the homes and the infrastructure supports that. So in the guide, we talk about the workflow for developers, and this is the way that we've laid it out. This isn't the way you have to do it by regulation. This is our recommendation of an approach that you could take. So six steps from identifying the buildings, and I'll explain what's meant by a building, and the parking spaces, and I'll explain how you know which parking spaces should be associated with which buildings, through to calculating the basic number of EV charge points and future connection locations that you need, and then looking at specific situations that might provide an exception to the rule, such as covered parking or a financial cost cap. And you might need to consult with your distribution network operator in order to bottom those out, and like to look specifically at how you should present your Part S strategy for building control for the smoothest, most efficient response. So buildings should have inverted comma around it really in terms of the regulation, because it's a defined term, and in different types of dwelling, it will mean slightly different things in practice. So a building for a detached dwelling is fairly straightforward. It's the whole building. For a terrace dwelling or a semi-detached, then it's going to be each individual dwelling in that row of terraces. However, for an apartment building, something that has a communal entrance and facilities, it's going to be the whole building itself. And you can see variations of how that applies for a maisonette, or where there are separate commercial facilities, you're going to treat the non-domestic and the domestic parts separately. And remember, all of this is in the guide, just explaining quickly in a quick way as we run through, but happy for any specific questions on these points. Next, you're going to want to look at associated spaces, and particularly whether which spaces are associated with which buildings on the development, because compliance happens basically at a building level. So firstly, you're going to look at any spaces that are within the development boundary, and they're going to have to be associated with one or more buildings. But depending on if they are specific for that dwelling or if they are shared, the flow chart here helps you to understand and to decide which building to associate them with. So I'll just run through that quickly. So is it associated? Obviously, if it's not within the development boundary, let's say it's on a separate piece of land on the other side of the road, then it doesn't need to be included within this. If it is demised to a specific dwelling, then it's fairly straightforward. That is going to be associated with that building. And if it's a communal space or shared between more than one building, then what we'll end up with is a situation where we will prorate spaces between buildings. And in the worked examples within the guide, we've tried to bring that out so you can understand how that would work in practice. So as we said, the basic requirement is to calculate the number of EVCPs, is to say how many dwellings are there, and that's how many are required. Also, where there are more than 10 spaces, then all of the other spaces will need a future connection location. There are exceptions though, some that are on a building level, particularly covered spaces, and some that are on a site level, which we'll look at, which is going to be the cost cap. So for covered spaces, then any spaces that are covered do not, there may be an exception to the requirement. So there's three situations here on the flow chart: one where there are no covered spaces, one where all of them are covered, and one where only partly they're covered. So if they're not covered, no exception, no problem. If they are all covered, then basically no EV charge points are required. And what you'll put in instead are future connection locations, and we'll dig a bit more into exactly what that means. But basically, the cable routes to the car parking spaces that will allow for future connection. The more tricky scenario, and probably the one you'll hit most often with, let's say, high-rise buildings that have covered parking, are when some are covered and some are not. And the flow chart there helps you to understand the difference. Essentially, when we'll look at this with a worked example as well, essentially those that are covered you'll hit the same requirement, but in lieu of EV charge points, you're going to provide future connection locations. It's worth pointing out that this is really only for the EV charge point numbers. The requirement for large car parks still remains the same. So if there are more than 10 car parking spaces, covered or not covered, you're going to end up in the situation where you're going to be putting in future connection locations to all spaces. Within the Part S reg, if you look at Regulation 44D, that explains where covered spaces and in a moment the connection cost cap come in. So for the connection cost cap, this is a if you like, an allowance to make sure that developers do not have to put in EV charge points if the connection cost is arduous over a limit of £3,600 per space on average. We don't think that this is likely to be encountered often in a domestic context. And the reason for that is because for the most part, when you speak with the IDNOs and the DNOs, then it looks like the maximum demand is accounted for, is diversified within the load that they look at when they calculate the required capacity for your new site. So the guide kind of brings this out, and we can talk about any specific questions, but it's unlikely that that's going to be required. I think the point here, though, is to check with your DNO or IDNO at an early stage as you go through development, and make sure that you know and they know where you are on that side of things. And again, just to emphasize that this is a site level requirement, so you're looking at all of the spaces on the whole development rather than the spaces associated with each individual building, as you are with the covered spaces exception. And so the point here is about submitting the Part S strategy to building control, and how do you make sure that what you submit aligns with what the best practice is. I'd like, if I can at this point, to start to bring the panel in to help explain some of this with much better than I can. So Alex Taylor from NHBC, perhaps you could help speak to this slide and just saying, well, what would building control be expecting to receive from developers?
Thanks, Adam. The building control would be looking for a full strategy, which should show where EV charge points and cable routes for future connection locations are provided. And this should be on a plot-by-plot basis or a building basis, depending on the applicability to the actual buildings themselves. The strategy should also sort of show which parking spaces are allocated or provided to each building. So it's clear that each parking space on a development has been linked to a particular dwelling. The information could be presented in either a schedule or a site plan, or a combination of the both, to allow this sort of checking process from building control to sort of be done more straightforwardly. If the cost cap's applicable, there should be a quotation provided from the DNO or equivalent, noting the average cost exceeds the £3,600 for the additional infrastructure. And if there should be a sort of further statement from the DNO confirming the maximum number of EVCPs that can be provided within the cost cap. The strategy should also refer to the sort of technical requirements and the cable routes and locations for EVCPs and future connection locations. At the point of lodging this information, full details of the actual installations not required. However, building inspection would expect to see full provision at the point of handover. So the future connections, EVCPs and cable routes would all have to be as per Section 6 in order to sign off. Where this sort of sign off cannot be provided, for example, where a communal parking sort of arrangements provided, it may affect the completion process. And for developments such as this, it would be worth speaking to the building control body at an early stage to make sure it's not going to sort of delay signing off particular properties if the individual car parking spaces aren't quite ready to be handed over. So yeah,
So at an early stage, then the kind of statements that are on the screen here are okay in a building control context, and they'll be clarified as they go through the process. And Peter Fennell from Persimmon, I know as we've looked at some of the questions that have come in already, there's quite a lot about the actual nuts and bolts of the installation itself. Would you be able to speak quickly to the technical requirements? Well, what are they exactly? What are they talking about in that context with Part S, please?
Yeah, cheers, Adam. So in terms of Part S of the building regs, there's several technical requirements. So the first one is that the electric vehicle charge point is designed and installed as described in BS-EN 61851. So that's effectively a British standard version of a European standard for EV charging systems. The installation has to be mode 3, so a dedicated circuit with an output of 7 kilowatts or greater. It has to be untethered, i.e. it'll be a universal socket rather than a cable attached to it. There are instances where you can have a tethered solution, but for a speculative builder, I would guess it would always be an untethered installation. There needs to be an indication on the unit to show it's charging, which can be make use of different coloured lights, or indeed a visual display. The full installation needs to comply with British Standard 7671, which is regarding electrical installations. So that goes a little further than EV charging, as in the document, but still refers back to EV charging. And finally, it asks for the requirements of the IET's Code of Practice for EV charging equipment installation to be taken into consideration as well. Those are the several technical requirements in terms of Part S.
Thank you, that's great. Let's move to the next slide then and look at the further resources. Just wanted to pick up these as well because I want to make sure that people are aware of particularly transitional requirements and the OPSS requirements and how they affect developers. So Alex, maybe you could speak to the first one, transitional arrangements, and if Peter, if you can speak to the OPSS regulations and just what's the impact likely to be on developers practically from that point of view. Alex.
So as Adam previously mentioned, Part S was introduced in 15th of June last year. So any initial notice served after that date would come under these regulations. But furthermore to that, the sort of changes occurred at the same time as FL&O. FL&O were all sort of building starts, so any building that hadn't started within a year of the introduction of the new sort of requirements would have transitioned to the new regulations, whereas Part S is a site start. So provided the site has started, and there's some definitions for that on the link there, which if they've been met, then the requirements of Part S wouldn't apply at all to the development site. But there may be other requirements for EVCPs relating to planning, etc. So it's maybe not completely outside of what you need to do.
Yeah, thank you. Peter, what are the smart charging regulations exactly, and how do they cross over with Part S?
Yeah, so I think the first point to make it is not a building regulation document. It's a separate document that comes from the Product Safety and Standards Office. It requires several more levels of functionality, which is all around smart charging. And the reason for that is there's a recognition that the grid needs to be more flexible going forward. So I'll quickly run through the requirements within this document and kind of expand on them later if required. So in summary, requirements are smart functionality, interoperability. I hate saying that word, but it effectively allows the occupant to change energy supplier, for example. it has to still operate even if it's disconnected from a comms point of view. There are safety provisions within there. There needs to be a measuring system within the EV charger. It has to incorporate preset off-peak default charging and DSR services, which can be changed by the end user, but it has to start as the default position. It has to allow for randomized delay function, and finally has to consider security. In terms of from a developer, there's 3 key bits beyond those requirements, and that's a statement of compliance, just to let the buyer know that the EV charger you are handing over is compliant with these regulations. There's a technical file, which is essentially a user guide that explains how the product complies. And then there's a register of sales, which must be kept for a minimum of 10 years, I believe it is. So there's a lot more in terms of technical requirements and quite a bit more in terms of paperwork to prove and to maintain compliance of that product.
And so if I'm a developer and I'm procuring EV charge points, is it that some out there may be compliant and some may not be at the moment?
Yeah, so the seller can't actually sell an EV charger unless it's compliant. However, there is the option of a voluntary enforcement undertaking offer, which means that if someone wants to sell a product that isn't compliant, they need to write to the OPSS, tell them why it isn't compliant at the moment, and commit to a time scale in terms of when it will be compliant. That changes throughout the industry. So I've seen some products that asked for 3 weeks to comply, and I've seen some that go as far as 6 years for compliance. So it does muddy the waters a little bit in terms of are you getting a product that complies with OPSS?
Great, thanks. And so, as Peter said, not Part S particularly, but important to know. So thank you. Let's dig now into the worked examples. For me, this is one of the easiest ways of actually getting your head around, well, what does this mean in practice? And hopefully, from picking up the guide, you'll find this section helpful. Firstly, detached houses are fairly straightforward. And you look at all of these in terms of, well, how many buildings are there? How many associated spaces are there for each building? And therefore, what are the compliance requirements in order to achieve Part S? And within the guide, there's a table that would break each of those things down. So detached houses are fairly straightforward because the spaces are clearly associated. There's one building there, and therefore you'll need one EV charge point. And obviously there's not more than 10 associated with a building, so these are going to be straightforward. It's worth noting that carports and garages don't count as covered in the context of single dwellings like this, or indeed a freestanding structure of any sort. It's only when it's attached and incorporated with the building that it will count as a covered car park. You can see the building 4 down the bottom there. The icon's not quite in exactly the right place, but it wouldn't be right next to the dwelling, right next to where you wouldn't mount it on the wall of the house, for example. And there may be different ways that you might look to do that, but particularly there we're talking probably about a post-mounted EV charge point next to the driveway that's wired back to the consumer unit. Worth noting, probably not on a fence post, which is considered to be a removable object. Often not helpful inside a garage where there's not the space to move around and use it properly. It can be on a pier to the garage. It could be wall mounted on that if the manufacturer's instructions, guidelines allow that. But yeah, so likely a post mount next to the driveway might be one way that developers would look to achieve that. So we said that terraced houses, when we look at the number of buildings, each one is an individual building. And we can see there that although you've got, I think, let's say 10 spaces there, there's 5 EV charge points, 1 for each dwelling, and those buildings are considered individually. There is a challenge potentially in this kind of situation. And I know, Crest Nicholson will have examples in that, if this kind of scenario. So Graham Gribbin from Crest, could I bring you in just to speak to what's the challenge that you see here, and what kind of solutions would you look for there?
Thanks, Adam. I would first take a bit of a step back from the EV charger locations and just say that it's important to note that we should be considering EV chargers in our layouts. So that starts with land and planning. So the first thing you should do before you put pen to paper is actually consider where your EV chargers are going to go on. You don't want to build yourself into a corner, so to speak. With good layouts, you can avoid some of the pitfalls here in terms of where to locate EV chargers. Well, clearly, as we've seen from the last slide, that a location for a detached property is quite easy, especially where you have a drive to the side. So you would likely mount it to the side of the wall beside the drive. However, on building 4, we did see a corner turner. So that's where you have got that remote parking space at the end of the garden. So other things, just to add to what Adam was saying, I would also think about the max cable run from the consumer unit to the mounting position of the EV charger, and the space requirement to actually mount that EV charger, as Adam was saying. I would take advice from the manufacturer. Again, so whoever is supplying that EV charger, they will be able to advise you, particularly on where it can be mounted, what height it should be mounted at. And that's especially important to avoid warranty issues in the future. I would also take advice for the length of the cable to the EV charger from any infrastructure companies. So that's your iDNOs and your DNOs, whoever's providing that electric. For instance, we know TriConnect, for example, will allow that cable length, and that's from the consumer unit right up to the EV charger will be 30 meters. GTC, a little bit less than that at 26 meters. So problems start to occur when you get past the semi-detached house type, because with a semi-detached, you have no consideration for access from your neighbour. So where you've got a shared pathway, clearly, as we can see on this actual particular diagram that Adam's showing. So 11 and 12, you have got a shared pathway. So if you consider 11 and 12 on their own, you could still actually mount that onto the front of the property and have a trailing wire which actually goes to the car parking space. However, when you do get into these blocks of 3, 4, and 5, however big your terrace units are, you need to start worrying about how you're going to avoid trailing wires crossing those shared driveways. And one of the things that we've been looking at is to site pole mounts onto past the actual to the parking bays, to the side of the parking bays. But again, be careful with that, because and again, it all starts from the layout. You would want to ensure that you have adequate room and space to ensure that you have got a position where you can put those pole mounts. I think we are going to move on to apartments, but I'll just have a brief talk about that. But there's more scope here. As you know, we're used to providing layouts with electric for lighting, for example. So this is really just an extension of that. But again, space required for the pole mounts, and when you actually have a chat with your DNO, most will be asking for an extra landlord supplier to supply the actual meters. So please do, again, have a chat with your DNO. Another piece of advice that, as we've been going through these processes ourselves, is that there's a lot of EV charger providers out there which will look at your layout and look for the best location to site these EV chargers. So they're a good shout. So do make use of them. And some of the drawings that they do provide can be easily submitted to building control to comply with those regulations that you need to. Thank you, Adam.
Great, thanks. That's a good shout. And so in this situation, it looks like you just go straight from the consumer unit in each vehicle, in each house, out to a post-mounted EV charge point potentially.
Yeah, that's right. So consumer unit straight out, provided you haven't got an adoptable footpath in the way. Obviously, that presents a problem. I think we'll be talking about adopted road and intersections with unadopted roads later. But yeah, it's literally from a consumer unit directly to the EV charger.
Thank you. And then you mentioned apartment buildings. Let's look into that and kind of give an example or two here about apartment buildings. So in this scenario, I guess it's more likely that it's fed off a common supply to the building and comes out to the car park than coming from each individual consumer unit in each flat. I'm assuming, and happy for any of you to put me right. So the main point here is each apartment building is considered to be a building. So you're still going to need one EV charge point for every dwelling that's in the building, but also where the number of car parking spaces goes above 10, you will also need to put future connection locations in there, and we'll see that just on the next slide. A couple of points to pick up here is that the double charge posts can be installed where appropriate. You can see those here in the drawing. And also notice the accessible space in the drawing here. Basically the requirement is that this is provided with an EV charge point first. So if there's any accessible spaces, they're going to need to have either an EV charge point released a future connection location in order to be compliant. In the situation where you have more than 10 spaces, then you'll need to put the future connection locations in as shown here. And again, look, you've got one location for each of those, each double set of spaces, and then one at the end where you've got the extra one. So even though the visitor space isn't demised to a certain apartment, is still going to need to, because every space needs a future connection location in this situation. The next example we'll look at is where you've got parking on the other side of a new road. And we come to this quite often in what we were looking at as we put the guide together, that this is going to be a fairly common requirement for, and we've shown a nominal site boundary there, but the sites could be much larger. So in this situation, then Graham, the local authority is not likely to adopt that road if you run the cable route straight underneath the path there to the space on the other side of the road. Is that right?
Yeah, so what we've encountered as we've been talking to highway authorities across the country about this typical scenario, I would say making sure before we put pen to paper, you try to avoid this circumstance. If you can't get over that, then there is ways and means to get around it. But what you can do is apply for a Section 50 license with the highway, but we know that that's likely to be rejected. So they don't want to see public apparatus in the highway. There's a whole host of reasons why that's a sensible approach. But in this particular circumstance, what you can do is use what we call a feeder pillar, which is basically a housing for your meter, a freestanding house for a meter. What I'd also say about this isn't something that your electrical company will provide. It is something that you as a developer will have to provide yourself and put the groundworks in. And then the electrical company will actually put the cutout in there, and the supplier will put in the actual meter itself. So clearly, when you start introducing the feeder pillar, which would be on the other side of the highway, so say you were introducing that feeder pillar to Parking Bay 61 or 67 down the bottom, and then you would feed each of those individual EV chargers from that feeder pillar. And that would then therefore mean that you would be introducing a management company and an EV charge point supplier. So that would be an EV charge point supplier would be a manufacturer that could handle how the billing was actually attributed to each of those properties. What I'd like just to touch on how a management company would manage an EVCP asset, because this is quite important. A management company will calculate the extra over cost of the management of the EVC provision, which will only be applicable to those plots that have a direct benefit. So what does that mean for the customer? Well, that means that the customer are essentially facing an increased charge, not just from the management company, but also from the standing charge that accompanies that. So, and that charge will be reviewed annually. So that means that that charge could actually go up over the course of time. So again, I would advise, if you can avoid that scenario, it's the best course of action. But there are solutions to get over these hurdles where you need to.
So let me break that down. You've got either the scenario where you have one feeder pillar for each dwelling. You could have that situation where each dwelling has its own supply on the other side of the road, and then you wouldn't need a management company. But if you end up with a situation where all of these are fed by one feeder pillar, which is, I guess, more likely, you're going to probably be in the realms of needing to have a management company that you set up for that group of houses in the same way that they've managed the gardens, the estate in a shared building.
Yeah, I would suggest that the one feeder pillar and management of the EVC chargers individually is the best way to do it. We know it's possible because you see a lot of commercial linked up daisy chained types of EVC chargers where you basically it can assign it to certain individuals, so they know who's using what charge. So I think it'd be really cost inefficient if we were going to provide a EVC charge pillar for every one of those individual properties. I'm not entirely sure if the DNOs would actually let you do that, but it is something, again, you need to have early engagement with those chaps, and also talk to your the EVC charge providers as well, because they'll have some great ideas of how to get over these types of hurdles.
Okay. And I guess, as you said at the start, this is to avoid the situation where you have a road that's not adoptable because of the cable reach running underneath it. The third option, I suppose, is that you run the cable reach direct from the homes and you have a private estate road. That would also be viable.
Yeah, again, from a major developer point of view, we'd avoid having private roads if possible. Just depends on what kind of circumstances you're actually in. But of course, when you don't have anything that is going to be adopted, then it is perfectly acceptable to run a cable under the road, because that would likely be, in the case of a shared driveway, for example. And just bear in mind the actual cable length again, to make sure that you're not exceeding that. And that again goes back to having a chat with your IDNO.
Yeah, thank you. So let's look at a similar situation, but in this case, the road is existing. So the spaces are on the other side of the road, but the road is existing. And Alex, just talk us through the boundaries and how do you, when do you say whether it's existing or not? How do you know how to apply the regulation in this context?
This is something that I think sparked this whole guide in the first instance. We had many a conversation, probably going back to February, March last year, where we looked at the approved document, looked at diagrams 1.1 and 1.2, and all came to quite different conclusions. So as part of our sort of exploratory work, we tried to sort of understand what approved document S was trying to describe as a boundary. And within the key terms, it does reasonably clearly talk about the boundary being the sort of land that's in control of the building owner. And then it goes on to talk about the erection of new buildings and land upon which work that is being carried out upon. So in terms of an initial notice, it would be anything covered within that sort of one initial notice application, which would tend to be sort of a development site. But on this example, we've got two different sort of boundaries marked. We've got an existing road which shows the house is being built on one side. We've got the parking spaces being built on the other side as a separate sort of development. So on this instance, the EV charge point, the EV regulations wouldn't be applied to those parking spaces. So it's, I'm not sure if it's a common circumstance, but it's certainly one that we've considered in our sort of work. So.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Thanks very much. And so here's an example where you've got several buildings or on one site, and you've got a communal parking area here. This is bringing out a couple of points. Firstly, if you look at 41, the spaces for 41, 42 to 45, then each of these has got, just like we have with the terrace spaces, there's two spaces associated with each building, because each terraced dwelling is a building. Two spaces associated with it, so each of them needs one EV charge point, and because there's two spaces, it doesn't go more than 10, and it does not need the future connection locations. You've got there associated with building C, I think it's 16 spaces associated with that, and in this case again you're going to need one EV charge point for each dwelling, and you've got them in pairs here, and all of the other spaces associated with that building are going to need the future connection locations. So hopefully that's clear, but I think it runs into a couple of things you've been talking about earlier, where you have to consider the length of the cable route from the dwelling to the space, which you know, I think Graham, you mentioned say 26, 30 meters of that order. I don't know what the scale is in this drawing.
What I'd say is that actual length of cable is really for individual properties. So when you are actually looking at apartment block there, they'll have a bigger allowance there. So it's I think it's 100 amp. So whenever we've talked to the IDNOs and DNOs, they've allowed for an additional landlord supply. So normally what you'd have is a landlord supply which does everything. You can run the lighting off it as well. However, in this circumstance, they're putting in another landlord supply, which gets you more juice into the building, which only serves those EV chargers. Again, back into talking to your EV DNO suppliers to make sure that you're doing what's appropriate and setting up your service company and etc. But I would just sort of say what is a future location connection comprised of? So you have to correct me if I'm wrong here, Adam, but it is just literally a duct and a drawstring so that you can actually lay that cable in future.
And yes, and I think that the signage that shows that it's a future connection location as well.
Yeah.
And it's worth pointing out, when we looked at the example in detached buildings, that you can put the EV charge point on a garage pier, for example, if the manufacturer's requirement says so. there are specific requirements for future connection locations within Part S in terms of the amount of space that needs to be around them in order to be compliant. And particularly with some layouts, you may struggle to hit those requirements, but that's only for future connection locations. Anything else anyone wanted to point out here, or there's only a couple more that I'd like to move to left in the pack, if you like, before we enter the discussion, and they're the less important ones in some ways. We'll look at covered parking, then we'll look at mixed use ones. Anything else you want to bring out on this drawing before we move on? So yeah, covered parking is actually a tricky one, but in terms of to understand what the regulation is asking for, and hopefully the guidance does make it straightforward to do that. There are two examples in the guide. I've just picked one of them out here, but there's also an example in the guide where you have more than 10 spaces. And in that situation, you're always going to end up with all of the spaces needing a future connection location. But in this situation, you've only got 6 spaces that are covered. And the requirement here is for 6 EV charge points because there are 6 apartments, 6 dwellings in this building. And so in this case, you can satisfy the regulation by firstly putting EV charge points for any uncovered spaces, the 3 that you see out here. Even though they're nominally the visitor spaces, these are the ones that need to have the EV charge points. And then putting future connection locations to a further 3 spaces inside, bringing the total up to 6, which was the number that was required before you consider the coveredness of parking. If you have more spaces, I say you'll need future connection locations to all the other covered parking as well. And finally, the mixed use apartment blocks, which as the hub, we focus on new build and domestic. So this may, though, be relevant to some of you on the call. In the situation of mixed use buildings, you're basically splitting the residential part from the non-residential part and treating them as 2 buildings. So in this case, you've got 10 apartments over some commercial units. The 10 apartments have the spaces that you see down the bottom left of the screen. And they're going to follow all of the rules that we've looked at as we've gone through. And for the spaces on the top right that are associated there with the non-residential units underneath, there are specific different requirements for the non-residential parts. So one's required 1 EV charge point, and also future connection locations where there are more than 10 spaces to the 20% of the remaining ones. But we won't dig into that unless there are specific questions on the Q&A. So that's the end of the slideshow, and thank you all for pitching in the different parts there. I've not actually been able to see the Q&A while I'm presenting, so I'll just try and pick out some of the questions here. We've got a fair few come in. We've got about 10 minutes left, so let's try to hit some of these questions, as many as we can. Were there any, you guys might have been able to see the questions, were there any there that you wanted to pick out particularly as being key discussion points?
Yeah, I tell you what, I'll pick up one from Niall Johnson on the smart charge point regulations. And the question was regarding if a manufacturer has a product that isn't compliant, can they still sell that product? I think that was the question. Apologies if my interpretation was slightly different now. But the top and bottom is if they have applied to the OPSS as a for enforcement undertaking, and we're still within the timelines of that agreed enforcement undertaking, then yes, they can still sell that product, even though it doesn't tick every box within the smart charging regulations. And that'll continue until the time period has elapsed, at which point they won't be able to sell it to the supply chain. and therefore we as a developer couldn't sell that house on if it had that EV charger that was now non-compliant. I hope that does answer the question.
Thank you. Anything else anyone wanted to pick out?
There was one easy one, which was asking about whether the webinar is going to be recorded and available for watching at a later date. I believe the answer to that is yes. So that's an easy one. And there's one from anonymous attendee about double charge posts count as 2 charges. And I guess the thing to direct the audience to is the government's FAQs. There's a question 7 on that, which says as long as it's able to sort of serve more than one parking space simultaneously and meets the technical requirements of approved document S, so that would be acceptable. Yep.
And there was a question from Dan Pipe, having looked through Part S, I've managed to locate provision for retail only or care homes, and perhaps James Elliott has answered that one in that they come under S4. Is that any further points from the panel as to that? We've mostly been looking at the domestic element, and I don't know the answer to that. I'm happy with what James has said. If just want to check if everyone else is okay.
Adam, can I pick up the one from Dan Piper as well about maintenance of fence posts?
Yeah.
Because Adam's asking whether you can mount to a dedicated oak post, and would that deem to be acceptable? I think the first thing to do is to actually talk to your actual EV charger provider, and they will advise you whether that's acceptable. But whenever we've actually asked that question about anything that oak, irrelevant timber, they will basically say no, because it's not a permanent structure. However, what you might find is if you have, in the case of a brick wall that goes around the garden, and that circumstances, that may be deemed as a permanent structure, which your EVC charger provider may accept as something that they can actually warrant. So it's another one where you need to make sure you talk to your EVC charger provider.
Yeah, thank you. And I know there was questions that came in around local authority requirements, and some planning authorities will set requirements for EV charging that is different from Part S. Have you guys had experience of that? And in that situation, how do you know which one takes priority? How does this work?
I think I'll start by answering that one, Adam, because we have had a bit of experience with where planners in particular go a bit OTT with provision of EV chargers. Now it's a nice thing to have. You've got 2 driveways. Should you have 2 EV chargers? Well, as it turns out, because the way that the actual load allowances are, it probably won't make much of a difference if you have 2 chargers on a driveway for 2 cars, because the load will be split. So you'll only ever get that 7 kVA coming through that network. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that there's a lot of statistics out there right now, and I think this is what's led the government to where they are now, to propose that 1 EV charger per property is actually the right way to go, and cars can swap over. So, I mean, we've had a lot of success taking an actual EV charger provider along to see the planners and just explain what that provision is trying to do and why it's adequate in its current format. So our advice would always be, again, chat with your EVC provider and see if they're willing to come and meet the planner with you if they are actually going over the building regulations.
Thank you. Anyone else? I'd sort of I've also got a question here about, no, I think we've covered that one, sorry. Would a carport be covered over by first floor accommodation class as a covered space and not require EV charge point? So I think the situation is kind of undercroft parking. Is it something like that that would be classed as a covered space? I would think. Any thoughts on that specifically?
I think you're right, Adam, because the whole thing comes from any space above which would be occupied by residents. So this is where I believe the government intention for covered spaces was the risk from fire, which is one of the reasons why they didn't want to see AVC charges actually in basements. And I would say where you have a residential accommodation above, even if it's a drive-through, which I believe this is what the attendees trying to get at. I would talk to the building control. Alex probably would be able to advise better, but I think that is a circumstance where you might be able to avoid putting an EVC charger in a.
Yeah. And this is a good one about Part M, accessible spaces, and whether the height of EV charge point controls is mandated there. Is there anything in Part S or Part M? How do those two overlap?
I've only seen manufacturers' literature on the heights, and I think you may see something coming through on Part M in future. But again, I would throw that one back to your building control to ask that question, just to make sure, or do we have to comply with Part M for height? Because it would be it's actually a really good, sensible question to ask. In the situation, private cables are located beneath shared parking courtyards. The cables may or may not cross. How's that dealt with in conveyancing? So in that kind of shared parking courtyard scenario, are there any things to watch out for in conveyancing with that situation? I would say that should be covered off in the by your legal department. So if you do have a legal department or your expert conveyancer, they will actually be dealing with the maintenance of any cables that run in those courtyards and making sure that it's legally okay for one or more to get in to do that actual maintenance. So because it is a shared drive, it would likely end up with being a shared cost and being accessible by all parties.
Thank you very much. Well, look, there are a few questions left that we haven't managed to get to, but I'd like to wrap up on time. So I wanted to give my great thanks to our panel, Alex Taylor, Graham Gribben and Peter Clennell. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all in the audience for your questions. I hope it's been useful. See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. Bye-bye.
Thank you.